Welcome to the Professor English podcast, where we don't just talk about English, we practice English. My name is Ryan, and I am your host. Today, we are going to practice the word somewhat, which means a little bit, just as it is used in the first paragraph of page 2 of 1984 by George Orwell. The volume was lowered somewhat. If you're interested in exploring the entire paragraph, I have provided a link to the entire discussion video in the description. Now let's take a look at the word somewhat. It's a fairly common word, but not usually given any priority in ESL classes. So if you haven't seen this word before, it's very similar to saying a little or a little bit. Let's practice using it, okay? Here's a sentence. Mary is annoyed. Uh-oh. Let's make that a little softer by using somewhat. Remember, somewhat means a little bit. Mary is somewhat annoyed. Somewhat annoyed. Mary is somewhat annoyed. Because you already probably know the word annoyed, let's change that to a similar word you probably don't know, which is peeved. Mary is somewhat peeved. Okay, how would you make a why question with that sentence? Mary is somewhat peeved. Why is Mary somewhat peeved? Okay, let's say because her car would not start this morning. Mary is somewhat peeved because her car wouldn't start this morning. Mary is somewhat peeved because her car wouldn't start this morning. Let's try another example. John and Mark are anxious. John and Mark are anxious. Let's make that a little softer by adding the word somewhat. John and Mark are somewhat anxious. John and Mark are somewhat anxious. How would you make a why question with that sentence? Why are John and Mark somewhat anxious? Why are John and Mark somewhat anxious? Let's say because they're waiting for their final exam results. They're waiting for their final exam results. John and Mark are somewhat anxious because they're waiting for their final exam results. John and Mark are somewhat anxious because they're waiting for their final exam results. All right, super duper job. Let's try another example. But before we do, I would just like to remind you that if you found this exercise helpful, share it with your friends. And don't forget to like this video or subscribe to my channel. Now let's move on. The article was interesting. The article was interesting. Let's make that a little softer. It was interesting, but not extremely interesting. We can use somewhat. The article was somewhat interesting. The article was somewhat interesting. Now, let's make a why question with that sentence. Why was the article somewhat interesting? Why was the article somewhat interesting? Okay, and the answer is because it had some new information. The article was somewhat interesting because it had some new information. The article was somewhat interesting because it had some new information. All right, great job. Let's do one more. Yesterday was cold. Now let's make that softer by using the word somewhat. So it wasn't extremely cold, it was just a little cold. Yesterday was somewhat cold. Now let's make a why question. Why was yesterday somewhat cold? Why was yesterday somewhat cold? Okay, and here's the answer. Because it was the end of autumn. Because it was the end of autumn. Yesterday was somewhat cold because it was the end of autumn. Yesterday was somewhat cold because it was the end of autumn. Yesterday was somewhat cold because it was the end of autumn. Okay, great job. Now, let's revisit the original sentence, which was Winston turned a switch, and the voice sank somewhat. Sink means go down. Winston turned a switch, which lowered the volume. A little, not a lot, just a little. All right, amazing job. It's been a real blast practicing English with you today, and I hope to see you again soon. So be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. I'll be back here again any day now with more fun and interesting phrases for you to learn. But until then, goodbye.